One. We're recording. Sam, thank you so much for being here, brother.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Man, you've become famous, or I suppose infamous in some circles,
Yeah, yeah, it's a
especially.
bit,
Uh, uh, what were you gonna say?
yeah, it's a bit nerve-wracking. I never thought I would be ever called famous or infamous, but yeah,
Especially with your recent um, encounter with Ambrose University. I was on Facebook and somebody shared it, and I was like, Sam, say, I know this guy. So,
yeah,
for people who don't know what happened with Ambrose, just to give like a brief background. So, what happened there?
yeah. So Ambrose University is a Christian school, in Calgary, Alberta, and sometime in either December or January, um, one of the student council members of the school reached out to me and asked me to do a talk at the school for Black History Month in February. And this person has become a good friend of mine. Her and I are like minded on these issues. Um, and she warned me that the school was very liberal, and that, she she knew that some of the students would not perhaps welcome what I would have to say. Um, but we didn't think it would end up being anywhere close to what it ended up becoming. But she told me that because she's like, hey, teach the truth, but um, for really her sake, that I should maybe um, be as tame as possible in what I say. And again, we're like minded. She agrees with me, but nevertheless, she's in a very difficult environment at Ambrose. So anyway, she invites me. She told the school about it. The school um, apparently vetted me, and I did a Zoom talk on what is racism. Really, what does the Bible say about racism? And I basically went through James 1, where James talks about partiality, to as the basis as the basis for describing what biblical racism, sorry, what racism really looks like in the Bible.
Hmm.
And then I also referenced Second Timothy 3:16, and I appealed to, to Scripture as an authoritative, inspired, inerrant word of God, and that it is sufficient in addressing all these issues. At the end, I asked everyone after my talk, I'm like, hey, you feel free to challenge me. But so basically, I didn't, I rejected the critical race theory thinking on racism. Um, and I'm sure, well, I could tell it was shocking some of the students there because they assumed because I was black that I was probably going to be repeating critical race theory. At the end, I could tell they were shocked. I'm like, look, don't be afraid to challenge me just because I'm black. Feel free. No, not a single person did. But maybe a week or two afterward, I got word from the student council member who reached out to me to do the talk. She said that, yeah, things had gotten a bit intense after the talk. Long story short, then I learned that the school was preparing a to write a public letter to denounce me without mentioning my name. Well, I thought they would mention my name, but then when I read the letter on their website, they didn't mention my name, which made me even more upset. I would have had more respect for them if they had actually mentioned my name. Um, and then, yeah, they were denouncing me for causing severe harm, apparently to the students. They suggested I was denigrating the students. They they were insinuating that I did not take racism seriously, and just just yeah. So that was the nature of their public letter. It was signed by the student council, not including the person who had reached out to me, but then it was signed by the vice president of student life at the school. And again, the university endorsed it because it was on their website.
Hmm.
But then when I replied on social media and on my blog, and then the National Post covered it as well, that's when they ended up basically removing the apology. And I had a talk with them after that, and they were not necessarily genuinely sorry. And this is not me. I want to be merciful and gracious, but they were pretty clear that they simply regret how they went about it instead of really what they did. So
That is, how do we even get to this spot where it seems that anytime there's somebody who is black but has a dissenting opinion of the prevailing view almost always gets some sort of heavy pushback against them. How do we get to the spot that where you yourself you freely give your opinion, your thoughts, well thought out thoughts, and then you get such a pushback? How do we get here?
Yeah. I think the reason why those kind of reactions are so common against black people who refuse to obey what the culture wants us to obey on critical race theory is because it exposes them, right? Because if I was white, they can easily just dismiss me as a racist, or they would never really want me to speak there anyway. But because I'm black, it goes against their narrative. And because they affirmed so-called lived experiences, it infuriates them knowing that guys like myself, just by existing, challenge their thinking. So then of course they have to then um, claim that I'm really just internalizing white supremacy or racism. Um, just by existing as a black conservative, though I don't really, I am a conservative, but that's not. I'm just a black Christian who um, believes what the Bible says about these issues. But anyway, just because of me being black and believing what I do, that in of itself challenges their thinking because they assume that all black people think alike, right? Because they think that all white people are racist and therefore all black people are oppressed in their mind. And if one black person or if a few black people believe that no, we're not oppressed, that already forces them to have to rethink their views. And they refuse to do that. So then therefore they have to demonize me.
That seems that seems very counterintuitive to the idea of being anti-racist, because you're homogenizing a whole group of people and saying that if you don't believe this, or this is the way you should believe and this is the way you should think, which is essentially what it is, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
you're sticking up like this, like a flower sticking up from the rest of the crowd, and they're like, no, 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 you people don't exist, and then they chop you off.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
It's counterintuitive to being anti-racist because they're not really anti-racist. Um, and that can seem shocking to a lot of people, but it's the way they label guys like me, the way Tim Scott recently in the US, the way on Twitter he was Uncle Tim was trending as a reference to Uncle Tom
wow.
against him when he gave the response to Joe Biden's speech to Congress 2-3 weeks ago. It was trending on Twitter for 12 hours before Twitter finally decided to remove that as going against their policies or their rules on hate speech. But it's because they're not really anti-racist.
Mm.
Critical race theory, anti-racism really is racism against white people, and then based on their condescending view or what some would call their soft bigotry, although I don't think it's soft at all, but their bigotry, the bigotry of low expectations for black people, that in of itself is racist. What they're really anti is anti the Western system, the anti-Western culture. They're not
Mm.
really anti-racism. They're which is why Ibram Kendi basically does say that racial discrimination is good if it produces equity, right?
Really,
So
he
they're
says
not even
that?
ashamed of, yeah, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he says that racial discrimination is good if it will produce equity.
How does that even make sense?
That's word for word what he says. Yeah, because that's the thing, right? Because you know, their goal is not um the Christian goal. We want to abhor what is evil. We want to love good and we want to establish justice. That's not what they want. What they want is really to produce equity, not equality, but equity. Equity and equality of outcome,
Mm.
because anyone who studied critical race theory will know that it's absolutely influenced by Marxism. So they're anti-capitalist, and he does say this in his book as well too, that he's an anti-capitalist, and that he suggests that he is a socialist or a communist. So many of these people. So basically, critical race theory is a form of racial socialism, right? A means of using the racial issues to produce socialism that he believes will benefit Black people.
So critical race theory is a form of social socialism. That's so. Would you say critical race theory is the direct result of cultural Marxist?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It really is. It's a form of cultural Marxism. It borrows a lot of the base and superstructure of Marxism. It borrows the conflict, especially the conflict theory,
Hmm.
developed by Marx, um, and then it establishes so in Marxism, you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. That's been adapted from more than just a mere economic or class point of view into a race point of view as well. And in How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi does lean on this as well too, in explaining the well, for example, you have the white privilege um, versus I, I guess Black oppression, in the Western culture. So so absolutely, this is a cultural Marxism because they, I'm trying. I don't want to go too far back, but a lot of Marxists, from 100 years ago, realized um, that the Marxism that they wanted to establish really wasn't working. The Soviet Union had failed in producing the kind of socialism that they thought would end up happening. That it was really the Soviet Union was not. Um, the Marxism or the communism that Marx wanted to achieve was really just it was just political elites using Marxism to produce um, um, their own interest, which is really what Marxism always ends up being. Nevertheless, because of that, they thought, well, maybe the only way we can really establish true communism is to make it more cultural, going past the class aspect and bringing in the racial aspect, the gender aspect, the sexuality aspect, and that of course is then filtered through the postmodern thinking, which leads to critical race theory that we have today.
Okay, so within critical race theory, wouldn't one of the tenets be the idea that race doesn't exist? A race is a social construct. But
Yeah,
then, how does critical race theory work?
and that's one of the odd things about critical race theory. They do absolutely reject the view that there's such a thing as race, um, which I'm grateful for.
Mhm.
Because we see the massive consequences in our society today of that false idea that we have different races. The problem is, and this is, the term racialized is used a lot. The problem is that they would say that though race is a social construct, we do live in this social construction. Therefore, we have to live in a world where being Black does matter, being white does matter. So though they reject that, though they agree that it is a social construct, they believe that we live in this construction. Therefore, we have to. Sorry. Um, because they're saying that because we do live in this, um, race construct. Being Black does matter. Being white does matter. So then we're not to reject it. We're supposed to then live in light of that.
Okay, so you live in light of, and so just practical questions that I would have would be like, what do you do if you're an interracial kid? Like you're half white,
Yeah.
half Black. Are you half racist? I mean, that sounds like a trivial question, but
Yeah.
really,
Yeah. It's funny you say that because, well, remember, just even by being a Black, so what would determine your racism wouldn't automatically be your your skin color, and if you are an interracial person. Now what they would say is you would be there would be colorism, right? That you may not be against Black people, although you could be, depending on what you believe, what your worldview is in their mind, but that by being light skinned, you may have a natural um, or socially influenced desire to um, to embrace white supremacy against black people who are darker than you are, right? So that would be their thinking, all right? And you know, critical race theory, they do not necessarily believe that white people are automatically racist necessarily. They believe that because of Western society that naturally favors them, that is what makes white people racist. That's what's a bit different. So they would not say it's a natural inclination for a white person to be racist. They would just say that it is a societal inclination that
Hmm.
makes them racist,
Hmm.
right? So that would also apply to interracial people or even black people like me, that they would say that, well, Sam, you are internalizing racism because of I know that you're internalizing racism because of the influences around you. And I've heard many people say this, right? Because of some
People
people
said
that
that to
I
you. Straight up said
yeah,
that
yeah.
to you. You're internalizing racism.
Yes, not to my face usually not to my face.
I mean,
uh,
you're a
uh,
big man. I don't think
yeah.
I don't think most people would have the balls to say it in front of your face.
Yeah, yeah, I sometimes kind of wish that would happen just because because I'm always like, man, how come no one said that to my face? It's always just by email or by social media, and then they see me in person and they're all just very nice after that. But anyway, yeah, but they would say that societal influences, especially in our Western culture, that they believe that the Western culture is irredeemably racist. So
Oh,
because of
okay.
that, it leads people into adopting white supremacy.
So it's essentially it's essentially like a bastardization of Christianity, where racism is this original sin that you can't really remove, and that you need to, and as a result of that, the whole system. I guess that's where the systemic racism comes from, and so
Yeah,
the savior to that would be uprooting anarchy of that whole system.
yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because you see, we Christians say that we are naturally disposed to sin.
Mhm.
All of us equally are naturally disposed to sin, but in our nature. Critical race theory says that all people, but especially white people, are naturally disposed societally disposed to racism because of the original sin within the Western system.
Uh,
That's the key. So, which is why I say that they're really anti-Western, the Western system, and not so much anti-white people necessarily. Because if
mm.
you're a white person like Reverend D'Angelo and you are an ally, then you are a holy saint. But if you are right, you're like the 13th member of the apostles, basically. So but if you're a black person like me
Yeah.
and you do appreciate the Western system, you love capitalism, and you love equality of opportunity, the equality of rights, you love liberty. If you love these things, then you are a racist. So so the original sin for them is really the Western democracy, the Western political system that values liberty and equality of rights under the law. They believe that that in of itself is white supremacy, and until we end that, and they believe that these laws were created by white people, especially cisgender white people, to borrow their phrasing, that in of itself shows that it was always meant to be for cisgender white people instead of being meant for all people, especially in their mind, black people.
But how does that even make sense to say that if you love liberty, or if you love the freedom to pursue your dreams, or freedom to do what you want to do, how is that intrinsically racist? Because it's, or intrinsically oppressive. I To me, that's intrinsically anti-oppressive, because it's now, because it allows you to do the things that you want to do, the things that you love. But you're telling me that critical race theory says if you hold to these things, the things, sorry, if you hold to these things, and these things are intrinsically racist because they were set up by Western folks, Western
Mm-hmm.
Caucasian folks.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
I, I'm just trying to understand how that even makes sense.
Well, so it borrows from Marxist thinking, right, of the false consciousness, which is that the bourgeoisie have not only oppressed the proletariat, the poor class, with just in Marxist time, forcing them to work at factories for little pay with no real control um, of just the money that they're producing, but that they've made them believe. The key thing is that Marx said that the bourgeoisie have manipulated the poor people into believing that what they think they're doing is really in their best interest when
Mm,
they're actually being oppressed.
mm,
So the point in there, the what critical race theories have embraced is you and I, in their mind, you and I believe that liberty is really liberty.
mhm.
You and I believe that equality is really equality. But no, we've been duped, we've been manipulated to believe that what's really oppression, what's really slavery is liberty, right? So they believe that what we consider liberty is an illusion,
Okay.
right? An illusion that only people who are either white supremacists or have been um, have embraced into or internalized white supremacy,
Yeah.
right, would only believe that. But only when you get woke, only when you have consciousness, that's when you see really what's at play. That's when you can see that what's happening in our culture, what we think is truth, is really just false. What we think is liberty or justice is really just injustice and oppression.
But what happens to our experience of living in a Western country where we have more freedom? I mean, I obviously didn't grow up in Canada and I moved to Canada about 10 years ago, and there's more freedom here than in India. So what happens to my lived experience of that? Does it not count?
Well, it counts only no the lived experience only matters when you affirm what they want you to affirm, right? So they would only say that, well, you've only internalized racism still, because remember they do believe in, of course, in post-colonial theory, which is another branch of basically critical race theory, believing that um, you've accepted what what white supremacists have been, or especially what colonialists have been saying about India or any
Mm,
nation outside of the West, which is that the West is has a hegemony on other nations, making us believe that other nations have it all wrong when it's actually the West that has it wrong, right? So it's very postmodern thinking. It's
okay.
cultural relativism, where truth or justice is really just based on um, is it's all relative, right? But but the oppressed, the marginalized, they're the ones who have true insight, right? That's where you have standpoint epistemology, right? That's where they're the ones that have true knowledge or perspective in what's really going on. So for you and I, we would be considered people who have internalized racism or white supremacy, and we're not seeing things clearly.
Okay, you said standpoint. What did you say? Standpoint. What was it called?
Epistemology.
Okay, what's standpoint epistemology?
So epistemology basically means how we acquire knowledge, right? Standpoint epistemology basically means that to have real knowledge or real understanding, real awareness, real to be really woke,
Mhm.
is based on your who you are, your identity, and your experiences. So it's very much tied to lived experiences, right? So the idea is, since they believe that Black people are oppressed, well, it's Black people who have a real understanding on what racism is, which
Mm,
is why they say listen to Black people. Well,
mm,
why? I'm a Black person. I can be wrong. I'm just as ignorant or as intelligent as anybody else. But since they affirm lived experiences, or especially standpoint epistemology, they believe that I have the standpoint, I have the perspective as a Black person, as an
mm.
oppressed, marginalized person, to have a keen insight into justice, on these issues.
And by the sounds of it, you obviously disagree with that.
Of course, of course. I'm a fallible person. I'm a sinner. I cannot be. The Bible is very clear. There is none righteous, not one. There's no one who does good. That wasn't about white people. It was about all people. We are all equally sinful. That we have all fallen short of the glory of God. Um, and you know, I God is, as I said earlier, God is the only infallible, inerrant, authoritative, inspired word. We should be listening to what God says in the Bible. And you can't trust black people the same way you can't trust white people because we are sinful, right?
Mm.
Let's trust truth. Let's trust God's truth. So just to give you a quick story that just came to mind right now. When I was 16 years old, I was shoplifting.
So gonna
And
say with shoplifting.
yeah, I I'm still a huge sinner, but I was an even bigger sinner back then. I was shoplifting, and I got caught. I was so nervous about doing it. It was a bracelet. It was so stupid. It was a no, was it a bracelet or a necklace? I don't remember, but something like that. And I was so nervous about shoplifting. I've stolen before many times before at that time, but I'd never shoplifted before. So I'm looking at it for a long time, and I guess since I was like frozen looking at how to go about doing this for like 45 minutes, the security guard, what I guess was having his eye on me the entire time. Anyway, I finally say, you know what, I'm gonna do this thing. I take it, put it in my pocket, and I'm about to get out of the store. The security guard then stops me and says, "Where are you going? What are you do? What are you doing? Empty your pocket." And I say, "Why are you stopping me? It's because I'm black, isn't it?" It was almost instinctive.
Hmm.
I didn't understand. I mean, I knew about racial issues and things like that, but and I had experience with racism before, but I don't even know how like, without thinking, I knew that if I said that, it would be beneficial for me. So as soon as I said that, he froze and he was terrified. And he just said, okay, just give me the stolen item and walk away. I imagine that if I had not said that, he probably would have called the cops on me, or I don't know exactly what they do in that scenario. But the point I'm trying to make there is, I know I was obviously lying. He knew I was lying. I knew he's not a racist. At least what he was doing was not racist. But what if somebody else comes in and now, like I said before, that was a false accusation. But now, if you say listen to black people, trust black people,
Mhm.
I say nope. What I did there was right. It was true. It wasn't a false accusation. It was legitimate. What do you do then? You're forced to believe me, even though I'm lying,
Mm.
just because I'm black.
Mm.
And that happens so many times. That's what happens with, I don't know if you follow the Micaiah Bryant issue. The
No. What happened there?
I think it was a 13-year-old girl, I think, who
Oh, the
got killed.
stabbing.
Yeah, yeah.
That was
She was
such a.
gonna.
I only read about it. Okay, just give the audience a brief background.
Yeah. So Micaiah Bryant, I believe she was 13, maybe 15. Yeah, maybe she was a young teenager, and the cops were called to her home, and as the cops arrived on the scene, Micaiah Bryan, this young girl, is in a fight with these other young black girls. So Micaiah Bryan is a black girl, and she has other people that she's fighting with. One in particular that is also a young, I believe, teenaged black girl as well too. They're fighting, and all of a sudden she takes out a knife and she's about to stab. There were other things happening before that too, but more so relevant to this situation. She took out a knife and she was about to stab this other young black girl.
Mm.
The cop then heroically shoots her and she ends up dying. But he did that to protect the other young black girl. Immediately, immediately, the cop is labeled a racist. Now,
Mm.
mind you, he saved a young black girl. But because he killed a young black girl to save that other young black girl, he's accused of racism. All that matters there in that moment, according to critical race theory,
Mhm.
is listen to black people, particularly listen to some black people. In critical race theory, whoever yells racism, if they're black, they are always right, essentially, always
Right.
right. And anybody who disagrees with them, is simply internalizing racism. There is no search for truth in critical race theory. There's no search for knowledge. There's only um, claims of racism, and there's only then what you have to do to produce equity for Black people. That's all it is. That in their mind, everything is racist. We simply, it may seem absurd that I'm saying this, but it really is. Everything is racist. They say that racism is the norm in Western society, is what they say. It's not the aberration. It is not mere actions. It's the norm. It's the air we breathe. That everything is racist in our Western society. We simply need to find all of those. We simply need to find all the particular instances that produces inequity and be anti-racist by dismantling them. That's all they're about. So that's why even in a case like that, it's all about forget the facts, forget the cops' reasoning. All that matters is what do some Black people, particularly Black critical race theorists, what do they say about that event?
So, uh, and that's why you have issues where people will say. I mean, I'm pretty sure Ibrahim Kendi says that black people cannot be racist.
Um, he actually
If
he's
they,
unique. So that's the dominant critical race theory view. Yes,
okay.
he deviates a little bit from that, but that's the dominant critical race theory view.
So is that why black people can't be racist? Because they live in a society in which everything around them is racist and the whole system is racist. So if you're the oppressed in the system, then the oppressed cannot oppress the oppressor, and therefore you can't be
Exactly.
racist.
Exactly. Yeah. And that in their mind, if you are oppressed, you're powerless. And
Right.
because you're powerless, in their mind, again, so remember that their key thing is that racism is the system itself,
Okay.
right? So if in their mind, if you don't have power within the system,
Mm-hmm.
then you cannot use a system, which they believe is the definition of racism. You cannot use a system then to oppress uh, other people. That's the dominant view. Now, that's a major problem because it's contrary to the scriptures. Racism is simply be showing partiality against someone because of their skin color. That is the biblical view of racism.
Or
But
you could that just seems like a common sense view of racism.
yes, but common sense is racist. And now I'm not even trying to be funny there. That's what they believe.
Oh,
That logic, right? Logic is racism. It is Western culture making us believe that what we really think is logic,
it's racism.
yeah, so that's that, yeah, which is why they want to get rid of things like standardized tests and things like that, because they believe all these things that we have created thinking that they're actually truth, logic, knowledge are all just white supremacists in our culture using their power to influence us, to manipulate us into thinking that what really harms Black people especially is good and justice.
So then the whole last summer, the whole 2 plus 2 equals 5 that was happening last summer, and saying that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is racist is essentially that.
Yeah.
It's that math is
Yes,
intrinsically racist.
exactly. Yes, because it is mathematics as we know it today is really created. It's a is racist as well too, because that's where Western society today really comes from. So so they believe this, but at the root of it, that's also because they're postmodernists. They
Mm.
reject truth.
Mm.
They form their own truths. They just want to go against the established truth from God and create their own truths, their own narratives. That's what they want to establish. Because then if it can convince people
Mhm.
that 2 plus 2 is 5, then you can convince them that anti-racism, which is really racist, is anti-racism, right? That's what it comes. So if you look at it, there's no real difference, right? 2 plus 2 equals 5 is the same as saying that real racism against white people is actually anti-racism. They want to they want to make everything upside down as a postmodernist group.
So, okay. So how would inside of the critical race theory, inside of that framework, how would it make sense when you look at other societies, right? If you look at Asian countries, if you look at African countries, where I mean, let's take Nigeria. Nigeria being a good example of the uh, the Fausa tribes and the fighting against the Igbo tribes, and the Nigerian civil war that happened. That was obviously they're from our perspective, they're all the same color. They're
Yeah.
all black, but there's internal hatred going on. Or you
Yeah.
take South Korea, you have the North Korean, South Koreans, it's North Koreans who escape North Korea and then migrate to South Korea. They're treated poorly, but from an outside perspective, they look the same race. So how does critical race? How do you make sense of cases like this, which is the norm in the rest of the world? Like Western society is not the norm here, right? Where a bunch of people from different cultures and ethnic groups are living together. For the most part,
Yeah.
everything is pretty ethnocentric.
Hmm. So they would say what they would say to that, and they've said this before. This is a particular the what you're saying is very it's a common it's commonly addressed by post-colonial theorists, which are basically a form more international version of critical race theory. Uh,
International,
and
the new
yeah,
international
they're
version.
they're yeah they're worldwide, bro, worldwide. So what they would say to that is it's a consequence of colonialism, right? They would say it's a consequence of white men, Europeans coming into Africa to teach Africans or Asians or South Americans not to value themselves, is what they would say. That white supremacy have infiltrated these cultures and have taught them and given them a legacy of not valuing their black lives or their own black lives, their black neighbors, and to turn them against each other. Because it's the same argument they use for black and black crime. What they say is, black and black crime in Canada or America, they would say, well, it's not necessarily the sin of those black people. It is the sins or the wages of white supremacy, is what they would say. So everything always goes back to white supremacy. It's always the Europeans, it's always white people. So look, Malcolm X said that white people are the devil, right? That's what critical race theorists believe, that white people are the manifestation of the devil in the world, that they're the ones who are always orchestrating. So they may not, now some of them will say this now outright, right? But some may not use those words, but that is what they believe, that since the evil one is really just white people controlling all society to pit others against themselves so that they can rise to the top. Look, honestly, I'm glad you're reacting this way. If most people were reacting this way, critical race theorists would not have any of our time whatsoever. It's a ridiculously illogical, um, anti-intellectual movement.
How is it
But
so accepted though?
well, one, we are sinful. We're sinners. We suppress God's truth to embrace lies. Um,
I mean,
so that's
this
a
seems like a pretty stupid lie. Like
it is. It
two
is.
plus two equals five.
It, it is. But I think a lot of people are dissatisfied and hate the Western culture, especially the Western culture influenced by
Mm.
Christian theology. So they're willing to accept almost anything outside of biblical truth, biblical principles. But but a big part of that is also just their utopian thinking. Marxism, postmodernism, critical race theory are all utopian thinking. Their goal, like their eye is set not on the means of how they get to this utopia state.
Mhm.
They're just focused on the utopian state and they
no
will
matter how
do
you get
whatever.
there.
Exactly. So because of that, people are willing to accept all these ideas if they simply believe it will lead them to a society where you will finally be rid of all inequality in their mind. But a bigger part of though is that the reason why I think people are not allowing themselves to challenge critical race theory is because they've embraced standpoint epistemology.
Hmm.
They will say, it all makes no sense to me. But they'll say maybe the reason why it makes no sense to me is because I'm white. So I can't
Oh,
understand it.
okay.
Right. Or with you, you will think, well, the reason why I can't get maybe it's because I'm internalizing racism. Right. So it's stupid critical race theory, but it's almost brilliant in that it forces, I can't say brilliant. It's very cunning
Hmm.
in that when 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 you challenge them with logic, the response is, well, that's just because of you've not had the lived experiences
Right.
to understand the world the way I see it.
Hmm.
And it's powerful for people because you do see George Floyd, that you see that whole video, you see slavery in the past, you see Jim Crow, and a lot of white people, or a lot of people in general, want to be on the right side of history. So even if they don't understand what's happening, they're thinking, well, the people who were pro-slavery, the people who were pro-segregation, they probably didn't understand it too. So I don't want to be like them. Even if it makes no sense to me, I want to buy into it anyways. That way, one day, no one will have a picture of me being with the racists like me and you,
Right.
essentially.
So this is the critical race theory sounds like heads I win, tails you lose.
Hmm.
There's no way for them to lose in an argument.
Yeah,
You disagree. Sam Say, who's you're Ghanaian or you're born in Ghana, right?
yeah, yeah.
Ghanaian, you're somebody who has a dissenting view of this prevailing ideology that's
Hmm.
very common. I mean, that's just pretty much seep through our society. You bring up your view, they say, "No, Sam, you don't get it.
Yeah,
You don't get it because you have this internal white supremacy, or you've internalized racism such that you hate your own skin." Is essentially what they're saying,
yeah,
and you
yeah,
hate your own people.
yeah,
So
yeah.
in those situations, I'm assuming, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming people have called you names. I think I mean, our friend Darnell Samuels, who hooked us up, who connected us. He was on this podcast a while ago. This was like almost 2 years ago, and he was telling me that people had called him Uncle Tom. Um, uh, I don't know if it the C word, um,
Coon. Yeah.
coon, right? And so I'm assuming you are probably now on the same receiving end that he was at. This is
Yeah,
that the
yeah,
case?
yeah. I would say that Darnell is probably even more liked, definitely probably more liked than I am. I'm. He gets it too, but I have a special knack of attracting enemies. But yeah, I've been called all those words as well. Yeah, I always tell people this, and it always surprises them. But I've been called an Uncle Tom or a coon probably 1,000 times more than I've been called a nigger. It's not even close. I've probably been called, and I know some people might be sorry. Some people might be uncomfortable with me saying the word nigger instead of the N word. I'm saying that just because I want to be very clear on that. But um, I've probably been called nigger maybe 10 times in my life, probably. But I've been called an Uncle Tom or a coon or other variations. My goodness, uh, I don't know, like 1,000, 5,000 times. Definitely in the thousands. Absolutely. Probably, yeah, definitely in the thousands. Through social media
Hmm.
primarily. Um, so yeah, it's very common. Almost any black person who has a dissenting voice on this has been called an Uncle Tom. Absolutely. It's very common. And what's it's not surprising, but what's difficult for me to accept the most, I hate it when anyone says it,
Hmm.
but it's common for so many white critical race theorists to say these racial slurs. It's a
Really?
race. These are Oh yeah. Oh. I've been called that by so many white critical race theorists, but they're justified in saying that because they especially hate me because they think they're self-righteous. Unlike those other white people in their mind, I am one of the good guys. And then they say, look at you. I'm even better than you. You're black, but yet I
Mhm.
love you more than you love yourself. I love
Wow.
your mom more than you love your
Wow.
mom. I am better than you. So they have a disdain for people like me because they feel even better about themselves when they can say, oh, look at this guy, look at this black guy. I'm a white guy, but yet I'm better than him. So then they want to make an example of guys like me, and they call me, these terms, but they also just feel justified because some of their black friends who supposedly hate racism
Yeah.
will approve of them using racist terms against me. That's the irony of it all. That you have anti-racist who hate racism so much in their mind that they're willing to use and encourage other people to use racist slurs against black people who do not agree with them.
To defeat racism,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
That
Yes.
is that is an incredible way to think. Like one of the most illogical ways to try to combat racism. It reminds me of this. Do you know this guy on Twitter called Toure? Toure. He's like,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I know him.
okay, so I saw this, and I'm going to read his tweet, and I want to know what you think about this. Okay,
Yeah.
and he's tweeting about something that just happened on May 12th, which is yesterday, I suppose.
Yeah.
Maybe you already saw. So he says, in quote, a 77-year-old white customer at Dunkin' Donuts was upset about something, and he called a black 20-year-old employee the N-word. The brother told him to say it again. The old man did. The brother knocked him out. The old man fell, lost consciousness, and died. He fucked around and found out. End of quote. That was his quote.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
So, um, calling someone the N word is a sin. It's a sinful thing. Um, it's not a crime. Killing someone is a crime. Um, I had read that tweet, and I'm glad you mentioned this. Last year, I wrote an article. I'm not always trying to be provocative in my articles, but it was, I guess, provocative. Again, I have a knack of being controversial, I suppose. But I titled the article "Is Racism Worse Than Murder?" And the conclusion is, of course, it's not. But for critical race theorists, it is because just to go back to that example, what made that black person commit murder was racism. Racism is, as we've talked about earlier, is the it's the very how do I say, it's the fountain that everything springs from. White racism and white supremacy is the is the abominable sin. It is the unforgivable sin. So when a black person is put in that position, according to critical race theorists like Toure, it is absolutely justified to react. He says in that tweet that, well, racism is violence already. It's violence. So then you have to react to that violence with violence. Again, that's because they are redefining all these things. Of course, it's not violence, but they're saying that because for them, racism is so embedded into the culture that it might as well be violence.
mm,
The problem is, of course, biblically, we know that that's not justice. First of all, insults are sinful and they will be judged by God, but they're not to be judged by us. Murder, taking someone's life, murder is of course never justified, and that person stands condemned. That the black person who killed the elderly man, which is just all the more evil. Just to punch anybody for that is evil, but an older man like that, that's just it's an evil thing. But anyway, just to get to the point, um, God will hold that person responsible for murder. Now, the white person, the elderly white person, I hate saying this, but it's true. It's true in that if this person is an unrepentant sinner, if this person was not a Christian, they're judged, they're condemned by God as well too. But the point I'm making here is with critical race theory, these things would be justified. Is that he's justified in killing this white racist because he is a victim himself of of um of white supremacist violence in their culture and then in that particular instance. So then you lose the biblical a very fundamental part of biblical justice, which is proportionality. With critical race theory, there is no proportionality whatsoever. It's that everything that has to do with racism is the worst form of any action against someone, and it therefore requires the worst form of retaliation.
So that then somewhat explains the Black Lives Matter protests that became very violent because racism is so violent and it's inherent inside of the system that you have to violently, I suppose, violently break things and harm people.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that because exactly it, right? In their mind, that society has been burning down their lives, so to speak,
Mm.
their whole lives with racism and white supremacy. So the only real retaliation, the only real way for them to have justice is to burn everything down again. And it worked for the case. Look, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on law, but looking at the evidence with the George Floyd issue,
Mhm.
I he should not have been. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but from what I could see, I don't see how they could charge him for manslaughter. I could see, but for everything else, for second degree murder, third degree, there's no way. The evidence contradicts that. But let's face it, when for several months America and other parts of the world, including Canada, suffered riots and burning because of that whole incident. When politicians had already, and guys like I initially thought it was also murder. I knew it wasn't racism, or at least I didn't know. I knew there was no evidence for racism at the time. But when when these rioters when these people have been rioting for several months, what happens in that case? There's no way he was going to be receiving a fair trial. No way. And that's important for critical race theory. That and this is why Ibrahim Kendi mentioned that it wasn't really about convicting um, Derek Chauvin, the cop. It was about convicting America. That's what he said right
Wow.
after
So
that.
he became Jesus Christ in one
Basically,
sense.
yes. Basically, yes.
Huh.
So you know, so I mentioned that because since they do believe that America has been destroying and and burning their lives, therefore they need to react in that way so they can dismantle white supremacy in America or really in Canada or in the Western world.
So okay. So what are examples of? I mean, to point before I even ask that question, I find it fascinating the globalization of American politics, right? Something that happens in America, which you and I aren't in America.
Mhm.
I don't know where the George Floyd's and Derek Chauvin the whole situation take place. Do you know where?
It was Minneapolis,
Okay,
Minnesota.
Minneapolis. So I guess that's like somewhat close to us. But you have whatever happens there. The Black Lives Matter protests start take place in L.A., Chicago, New York. Starts spread all across the U.S. Then it comes here, Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa. I know in small places like out east that happen. Then it starts taking place. Black Lives Matter as a result of what was happening in the States, in the UK, and France, and then New Zealand, and then Australia. It's and so the thing that I've one thing that been thinking and I've continually thought about since the whole Black Lives Matter became a thing in like 2014, 2013, I forget when exactly, is is it is it the case, right, that the black experience, as I don't know however people want to define it, the same homogenous across all these countries? And my gut reaction is that's certainly not true. Just a human experience is a human experience, right? But the globalization of American politics, where Black Lives Matter specifically has taken a hold of so many
Yeah.
movement esque changes. What is your take on that?
Yeah. That's a great question. Something I think about a lot myself. So there are several layers to this question. Um, I can start with the first thing about the idea of the black experience being the same or not. Um, so there's something called the black culture, um, which I hate that term in so many ways, but
Mm.
the idea of a black culture, is that that black people, there is a culture that black people tend to, um, you know, um, practice. It's really black American culture is what they mean. However, this black American culture is primarily, there are other points to it, but fundamentally it's the hip hop culture
Mm.
and its variations or influences. And this black culture is again primarily it's American, but now it's become part of Canada. It's a lot of black Canadians. When I was growing up, I was part of this black culture. Black Canadians, black Britons, black Australians, black Kiwis, I think is what you call New
Yeah,
Zealand people.
Kiwis.
Yeah, black Kiwis, black French people. Um, so many, basically every Caribbean black people,
Mm.
African black people have become heavily, heavily, heavily influenced by this black American culture. This is even well before critical race theory became mainstream.
Mm.
You've had this unified black culture with certain variations, but you've had this. There's a reason why Drake, who's from Toronto, can adjust seamlessly in America. There's a reason why a lot of Torontonians, black Torontonians, have become are. There's a reason why what they rap about or sing about is not foreign to their black peers.
Mm.
Um, a lot of how I was thinking is very much was very similar to the way a lot of my black American friends were thinking. A lot of my black British friends were thinking. Hip hop culture has become so dominant for black youth that there is a central theme now for many black people across the world based on that. So black people, of course, are not a monolithic group, but there is a culture that has become dominant for many young black people over the last 30 years. With that being said, of course, there's still very big differences. I'm a Ghanaian. We have a different culture than even East Africans. Some similarities for sure, absolutely, but there are still some major differences. Especially, there's a big difference between, um, well, I'll even say this: even Caribbean people and Africans, we definitely have some similarities because they are descendants of Africans, and they've still maintained a lot of their African culture, which is true for a lot of Black Americans too. Some of them have still maintained their African culture historically, but there's still Western Black people. When I showed up from the plane, I was very different than the average Black Canadian who was raised here. There's a huge cultural difference. What happens then is, of course, as I become, um, as I take part in this racialized culture, I see where my people are supposed to be, which is the hip hop culture, Black culture. Anyway, now to finally get to, I think the bigger point though is there's a reason why I've been saying Western culture a lot throughout the whole conversation. Critical race theory is predominantly a very American concept, but it is it really is international in that its ideas are that Western culture, not just America, but Canada, America, Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, um, the Scandinavian countries, primarily the English speaking nations, but everywhere, every Western culture or every Western nation is white supremacist because of the influences. Either they're deviating from that or not, because of the influences of the past, the influences from Western society or Western philosophers, um, Western democracy on their system. Because of that, they are white supremacists. Therefore, even though I am not in America, even though they might be varying degrees, Canada is still a white supremacist nation. Again, historically, or even right now, it may not be as severe as America in their mind, but that me as a Black person in Canada and some of my cousins in America, we are being similarly oppressed by two white supremacist nations. There's a reason why Trudeau himself, which I find it funny, because he is the leader of our political system, but he says that Canada is systemically racist. And I would say, well, if that's the case, then why are you still
Why
go?
is that?
Why are you still the prime minister? Right? Like again, it's so illogical. Anyway, and no one's asking. Okay, then you are the problem, then, right? So are you calling yourself a racist then? Um, but anyway, so so going back to your point, it's American, but the reasons why it resonates with so many other Black people from across the world is because of the belief that their nations are also white supremacists as well. And honestly, there's also a weird envy for oppression. That's part of it too,
Mm.
right? That a lot of Black people here, I mean, like anywhere really, are not oppressed, but they want to feel like they are because by with oppression or with the sense of oppression comes power, oddly,
Mm.
right? And then more from a cultural media perspective, American society, American culture dominates the world, right? Hollywood, American, it just naturally, there is an allure about America that is international, that just worldwide, every nation is captivated, every people are captivated by American culture. And even here in Canada, right? I mean, we have basically every, like our media are just dominated by American news, American culture. So sometimes it's easy to forget that we're in different nations because of just how much our news is dominated by American politics and American culture.
American culture. I think it's funny that you say there's a certain allure to American, the United States as a whole, and to me that allure has always been and will always be liberty and freedom, right? It's that you get to go to America and you get to chase after the American dream, and
Yeah, yeah,
but that but essentially inside of this critical race theory, it's not even that. It's even though Canada and the US exist as a result of the US rebelling against the Brits and then them all starting their own nation, and the Canadians are still a monarch under the Queen. The idea here is that it doesn't matter so long as you're Western, you're systemically racist. In
yeah,
like you just can't avoid that. Get out of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And that that reminds me of this professor. I don't know if you've heard recently in New Brunswick. Sorry, not New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Mount Allison University. I forget what her name is. Professor Hazimi, I think her name might be. I could be getting her name wrong. Uh, but this was just a month or so ago, right? She has a blog. One of her colleagues and student members wrote some articles saying on social media somewhere saying that Canada is a systemically racist country. And this woman, this professor, she is a Lebanese refugee, right? So she came from Lebanon after the Civil War, much like God said, um, and now is a professor. And so she responded saying that system Canada is not a systemically racist country, but there are racist people.
Yeah.
Of course, like anywhere you go, there will be somebody who judges you based on your skin color.
Yeah.
She makes this comment, and now she's suspended from Mount Allison University.
Yeah.
And this seems, Sam, to be something that's becoming more and more prevalent. Anytime you speak out and say, "Hey, systemic racism," I mean, I've had this conversation with many people. I listened to that conversation you had with doing right after the Black Lives Matter protest with
Are you stucky?
Darnell,
Oh, okay.
Danfee,
Sorry.
Darnell,
Yeah.
Danfee, and you. You guys had a three-way conversation, and I enjoyed that conversation. I thought that was a very, very fruitful conversation for me to listen to. Um, but you and I both have friends who are very pro critical race theory, generally, very Black Lives Matter as a whole, and now this idea of systemic racism, which is inherent in both of them. You as a you and I both agree that you being black doesn't really add anything to your logic, but I have to ask you as a black person, what do you how do you how do you respond to that idea that Canada is a systemically racist country?
My, I always say it's on the oh man, what's the word? The burden of proof is on them. It's not on me. I'm not the one making a charge against the nation, so therefore they need to convince me that Canada is racist. So and I will answer your question. I'm not just trying to brush past it, but um, I always ask people, okay, just give me one evidence of a racist policy in Canada, particularly against Black people. Just give me one. If you give me one, everything I've been saying every single thing I've been saying about systemic racism is wrong. Just name one. I've been saying that for the last 3-4 years. Not a single person has been able to give me one. Recently, well, maybe last summer, one white girl was was sure that she would find one. She's like, just give me some time, I'll go find one for you. But hold on.
Give you some time.
Exactly. So you're sure that there is systemic racism, but you need me to give you time to go find it, which means you're just assuming there has to be. You don't really know that there is one already. Well, it's been over a year. None. Except for recently when I reminded her and she sent me
You
something
went and
about
reminded her that you're waiting for you.
basically, yeah. I'm kind of petty a little bit. I'm kind of petty. Um, but and she just gave me this an article about I think it's in California, where California they've banned I think some private companies banned like hair braiding and things like that,
Okay.
which obviously affects a lot of Black women, and they banned that as a racist practice. So I'm like, okay.
Okay.
I'm like, well, it was not. First of all, that's not a racist policy at all. Like it wasn't the government who introduced these policies. It's the government did not say, "Hey, Black women, you cannot braid your hair." That's not what they did. You're referring to private companies simply just saying they do not want. Now they didn't even make it racial. They just didn't want anyone, period, braiding their hair because of what they think is in the best interest of their customers or their practice. I don't know. But again, there was no partiality against Black people. It applied to white people as well. It just happened to be that Black women tend to have more of their hair braided. Anyway, but I'm like, well, but in California they still banned it. I think it's stupid they have to ban it, but they still banned it. So where's the racism there? What's the racist policy there? Anyway, to get back to the question, I always keep deviating from the point. Not a single person has been able to identify a racist law because they can't. They can't. Systemic racism, from a biblical point of view, from a logical point of view, should be a law or a policy within the system that discriminates against Black people or anybody else. They do not have that. There is none. Except, this is going to be maybe deviating a little bit. We do actually have racism in the system, but not against Black people, but against indigenous people by trying to help them. We've produced the way we've treated indigenous people. We've created again the soft bigotry of low expectations. We're producing all these laws and all these policies and all these programs that's actually hurting them, and we all know it's not doing anything. But instead of wanting to do what's right for them and for anybody, we're actually just throwing money at the indigenous people, harming them just so we can get votes and just wash our hands of the problem. That's actually partiality against them. Oddly, too, affirmative action is also racist. They may say they have good intentions, but I, as a Black person, do not want to receive favoritism from anybody because of my skin color. I want complete impartiality. But in that sense, there is racism in our system, but it's meant to help Black people. But that's not what critical race theory mean. That's not what they mean. What they mean is there are actual policies that are against Black people, and there is none. They cannot find a single policy. But of course, that's not what they really mean, though, right? For them, the whole system itself is racist. So for them, the evidence for racism in Canada isn't a law or a policy. It's just the fact that Canada exists. That itself is evidence of racism.
Right.
Yeah.
And this reminds me of your point about Justin Trudeau. When the Black Lives Matter protest happened here in Ottawa, the man showed up, right, to the protest.
Yeah.
Essentially, as you said, he was protesting himself.
Yeah.
Which,
yeah.
if you say, "Hey, if this is a systemically racist thing, then you should step down and give it to somebody else," which reminds me of it's becoming very commonplace, and I'm sure you've probably come across this so many times, where universities, especially, are the grounds. University academia is the grounds where almost all stupid ideas come out of academia.
Yeah.
And one of which I find fascinating and baffling is this idea of I acknowledge that this land does not belong to blah blah blah. It belongs to this blah 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 group, right? And almost always now it's on syllabi. I haven't been in university in a while, but it's on syllabi. They say this right before a service. They'll say it. What is your take on that whole proposition that they say, or conjecture, I should say, more like conjectures or statements?
Well, it sounds like a ritual, right? It sounds like a spiritual, religious ritual that we've embraced these ideas to a level that it becomes in of itself a religion. It becomes we are deifying marginalized people, because the way a lot of our society treats indigenous people or marginalized people or Black people is that we can do no wrong, that we are inspired, inerrant people. And essentially, there's worship for the marginalized people, which is why I said there is power and oppression. But I think all that's ridiculous. Look, I guess I've offended many people, so I might as well offend indigenous people too. Um, but look, I'm sorry, it's not their land. I'm sorry, it's not. It's their land the same way it's my land. That if you are Canadian, you have access to this land. Look, I am a Ghanaian. We didn't always own the land. Somebody else owned it. We um, colonized that land. And then some of the land that we did have, some of our other rivals came and fought us and they colonized that land too. It's human nature. No one really owns the land. Really, we don't even own the land. It is God's land. No one owns anything in earth. It belongs to God. God himself gives it to us for his own pleasure. And look, again, I'm not trying to insult anybody, but indigenous people were killing and slaughtering and colonizing themselves before the Europeans came. And honestly, this whole idea of an indigenous people is ridiculous anyway, because there is no now we've made them like the way we have made Black people a monolithic group. Indigenous people are not monolithic. They have their differences, and they had that before. So we are all sinful and we all do good deeds. So this idea that we need to um to show respect, it's ridiculous, because it's not their land, right? It's This land belongs to every Canadian, including them. Absolutely, it's their land in the sense that they are Canadians, but it's not their land in the sense that they are indigenous people.
That's an interesting point that you make. That even before the European Europeans came over, the it was very much the case in if you look at any historical, tribal literature,
Hmm.
tribes generally have tribal warfare. They're
Yeah.
always trying to get one off the other, take their land, take their women, burn the village, take their weapons.
Hmm.
So this is it's very common. And so your point about now we've made indigenous people a monolithic, homogenous group as if they are one. That's almost
Hmm.
degrading to their culture,
Exactly.
right? Because you
Exactly.
have Mi'kmaq tribe, I believe they're from Nova Scotia. They're probably very different from another tribe out west.
Hmm.
But now we've said no, no, these are all indigenous. But at one point, they were not indigenous. You know, they were indigenous insofar as they came over the strait. You know, came over, stayed here. Some of them
Hmm.
went down. So you have this idea of I don't know what it is. You know, is it this innate human or innate liberal society concept where we always want to give somebody something as if it's theirs and it's not ours. It feels like a self perpetuating guilt trip
Hmm.
that we're doing here. Right? You're like, I feel guilty, so this is actually yours. Just like critical race theory, I feel guilt. If I'm white, you know, I'm
Yeah.
guilty for my ancestors' sin, so I'm sorry, and I give you X, Y, Z.
Hmm. Yeah. I wouldn't even call it liberal. I know what you mean, but I'll call it leftism. Because liberals value liberty.
Hmm. Progressives,
Leftist,
maybe
sorry.
progressives.
Yes, yes. Although even there, they're not progressives; they're just regressives, right? But I'm sorry, I keep I keep changing your wording. Um,
I like how
but
regressives works.
yeah, um, but no, you're right. There is this. I'm sure many of them are sincere. Some of them are just deceived in their understanding, but you have many who are also cunning.
Hmm.
Um, you have many who want to use the indigenous issue to expand the government to because let's face it, if you can throw a lot of money at the indigenous people, then what's next? They can say, well, why can't we throw money at other people too? And it's a way of oftentimes scheming to just expand the government's role in every Canadian's life. Um, but yeah, and look, if we think about it, the indigenous people have already a form of communism already, um, where you don't really, many of them don't control, they don't own land. If they own land, then they lose a lot of their other privileges. Um, so you have, we've created this socialist communist um, system for the indigenous people.
Mm,
And once you have that, it's naturally easier to implement that for the rest of Canadians.
mm,
Because the issue with leftists or regressives is that the difference between them and the socialist or the communist is that they're just slower at progressing or regressing
mm,
into communism.
mm. I I think you're absolutely right about the indigenous, the way that Canada's treating it. Francis Widdowson, who's like a um, political theorist professor out in Alberta, she was on this podcast a few times, and one thing that she said that stuck with me was when she did her research and she wrote her book, she found that the majority of the money that was going to indigenous groups were going to these intermediary lawyers, and they were
Yeah,
taking a chunk of it. And
yeah,
then some of it, then when it went back to the indigenous groups, to the tribes, then the chief, if the chief was corrupt, he would take, or she would take, I think
yeah,
chiefs are mainly he's males, they would take the majority of it. So then you have this like, it's almost a beautiful corrupt system
yeah,
where the government keeps giving money and people feel good. They're like, oh yeah, we're giving them more money. When in
yeah.
reality, the actual
No,
people that need it and are in dire situations, they don't get it, the
no,
majority of it.
no. And isn't that what communism is, right?
Mm,
That there's always the elite in that system that thrive. The money always goes to them and not to the people that's supposed to be helping. But yeah, it's I've read and heard similar cases of people who work at reserves and things like that, and I've seen this, and it's not, it shouldn't be surprising. Whenever you have soft bigotry in that sense, when you're throwing money at people thinking that will solve things, you're only giving people the incentive to abuse that. So it's a mess. And again, not many know this, but some people know this, but they don't care enough because the people who get the money, the people who get the money, are the ones who have the power. They're the
mm,
ones who have the power to vote for, certain kind of politicians. So no one asks questions. Nobody wants accountability. They just want to send them money so they can say, "Hey, we sent this money to this tribe, to the indigenous people, just so that really it can affect them politically."
mm. That's a beautiful point. Um, do you have any last words of wisdom for our audience? It could be about what book. Okay, this is actually a question that I think would be very helpful. What books should people read, both um, Christians and non-Christians, if they want to find out more about critical race theory? Because we're here, you've explained it, the, the you've explained what critical race theory. But if somebody were want to take a deep dive in it, okay, I want to understand a bit more. Where's
Hmm.
Sam reading his works so I
Okay.
can.
Yeah, no, that's when you were saying any last words of wisdom, I was going to say, well, I can give you last words, but I don't know if they'll be wise. Um, but yeah, Fault Lines by Voddie Baucham is a book that just came out recently. It's called Fault Lines, and it's a brilliant, brilliant book. It's really crucial. This is so Voddie Baucham is a Christian, but this next book is not by Christian authors. Actually, it's by atheists, but it's called Cynical Theories. Brilliant book,
So okay,
but
that's with
by
what's his name, James Lindsay.
James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose.
That was good.
Um, really good book.
Okay.
It's extremely influential in my thinking on these issues. Um, what else is there? There is a book that I actually I didn't co-author, but I wrote a small section in there, and it's called Confronting Injustice by Thaddeus Williams.
Oh,
And
I didn't even know about this.
oh,
That's
I mean,
okay. Okay.
no,
So
it's not.
okay.
I don't talk about it a lot. Sorry.
What's the book called again?
Confronting Injustice
Okay, confirming.
by Thaddeus Williams. Um, it's not my book. I just wrote this like a page where a bit of a testimony of sorts. Um, what else is there? There is Explaining Postmodernism by I think his name is Stephen Hicks. I think his name. Really, really good book as well too. It's not directly addressing critical race theory, but it's addressing the postmodernism, which is a huge element of critical race theory. Trying to look at my books here again to remember. There is The Madness of Crowds by oh man, I'm forgetting his name,
Madness of
by
Crowds.
Douglas Murray, a
Okay.
British conservative author. He's brilliant. Um, oh, there is White Guilt by oh man, I can't think right now. I'm so sorry. I look at my books.
White
I
Guilt.
forget his name. By Shelby. What's his first name? Um
Oh, Shelby.
no, sorry, Shelby Steele. Shelby's his first name. Shelby Steele. There's books by The Quest for Cosmic Justice
Mhm.
by Thomas Sowell. There is there is Discrimination and Disparities by Sowell again. There is yeah, anything by Sowell you'll do well. I have other books I'm sure, but I can't think right now.
And that's enough books for somebody to study and get a deep dive on. Okay. And where can people find you, Sam? They want to look.
Uh
They're like, okay, I want to find where Sam is living.
yeah,
No,
they can
not your
find
address.
I was gonna say, you can find me in the middle of nowhere. Not gonna give you my address. I have enough enemies. Okay, I don't want to be running away. It'd be a very short run though. I'm big. Anyway, no. Uh, yeah, I'm at slaughterright.com. That's the
Slaughterwright.com.
name of my blog. Slaughterright.com, and then I'm on social media: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at slaughterright. Um,
Slaughterwright. Okay.
so yeah. Oh, I'm also on Patreon if people
Patreon. Okay.
wanna support
Slaughterwright.
me as well. Yeah, yeah,
And we'll put that in the
yeah.
link. All of this in the
Oh,
link. Okay.
thank you.
Man, Sam, this has been an an incredible conversation. I really
Oh
appreciate
well,
the conversation and your insights.
I'm very grateful. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.